The Carpenter Center for the Visual Arts at Harvard University is the only building in North America designed by modernist architect Le Corbusier. Constructed in 1963, the building houses studio space, the Harvard Film Archive, and gallery space, which is open to the public. I took a trip to Cambridge on a drizzly December day to explore Le Corbusier's work in person, and to try to understand how the architecture of the building relates to its program. The definition of program differs depending on the architect, critic, or theorist defining it, but the general concept is summed up in Bernard Tschumi's Sequences from 1996. Tschumi writes that program is a linear experience of events within a building, and that the relationship between the arrangement of physical structures and their use, intended or not, falls into three different relational categories. Indifference, in which program and spatial sequence are independent of one another, reciprocity, in which the two are interdependent and enhance one another, and conflict, in which the space clashes with or interrupts the user's experience of the events within it. This definition provided the theoretical lens through which I experienced the Carpenter Center during my visit, and is the framework upon which I will analyze the building in this video. The Carpenter Center is designed around an S-shaped ramp, which rises up from Prescott Street, passes through the center of the building, and then slopes back down to meet the parallel Quincy Street. The ramp is a classic example of what Corbusier calls the architectural promenade, a sequential feature that he returns to in many of his works. Flora Samuel writes that Corbusier was perhaps most interested in architecture as a means for training people in the process of savoir habiter, or knowing how to live. The promenade was essential to this. Corbusier would provide a specific itinerary of movement through his buildings, and along that itinerary, the buildings would reveal themselves. In the case of the Carpenter Center, Corbusier's ramp serves both as an architectural promenade, along whose route the building evolves, and as a functional connection. The story goes that upon visiting the Cambridge plot where the building would be located, Corbusier was delighted to see college students using the land as a shortcut between classes, and high schoolers cutting through to the nearby subway station. The ramp, then, plays many roles: shortcut, promenade, and a radical public vantage point into the ivory tower through massive glass windows. As I traversed the walkway, I got far more than a mere glimpse into the studio spaces. Corbusier's use of physical transparency created a slippage between indoor and outdoor, private and public. Renowned for his mastery over light, the architect took the scattered sunbeams within the covered opening in the building and distributed them throughout the interior. I imagine that for the students inside, this openness to the outdoors would have a significant effect on process and experimentation. In this instance, we can see the reciprocal relationship between form and program. The events taking place in and around the building are enhanced by the architect's choices. I recognized another Corbusian motif in the roof garden just outside the third-floor gallery. It looks out over the Harvard campus and provides a place for relaxation and contemplation. Roof gardens are one of the elements laid out in Corbusier's famous 5 Points of Modern Architecture from 1926. He believed that a roof garden both served practical purposes such as drainage for flat roofs and engaged the user towards savoir habiter by bringing nature into the built environment. Another of Corbusier's 5 points, pilotis, or thin supporting columns, are immediately recognizable at the Carpenter Center. Corbusier wrote that by lifting the building off the ground, more space was made functional. In this case, these open areas are used as a parking lot, passageways, an entrance into the first-floor gallery, and a concrete seating area which is no longer in use. Most interesting to me were the passageways. Although the building is centered around the ramp, Corbusier provides multiple choices to the user, allowing them to create their own narrative, promenade, or sequential experience of the building. Corbusier employs a variety of window types in the Carpenter Center, including angled full-height windows, striped curving windows, and glass blocks which distort light in the stairwells. From the outside, I felt these choices made the exterior an unappealing patchwork. However, Corbusier was a painter as well as an architect. It is as if here he has put down the pencil and grabbed his paintbrush, rendering light in different patterns and qualities. Additionally, the Carpenter Center is dotted with primary colored operable shutters. They are featured in the architectural guide provided at the building. The 131 shutters not only provide pops of color, which contrast the various types of concrete used, but were intended to aid in ventilation. It's time to go inside, but here's where the ability to choose your own path through the building becomes disruptive. On my first approach, I found myself questioning where the entrance even was. What could be characterized as the main entrance is almost hidden, a dim nook underneath the overhanging structure. Here, you enter directly into the first floor gallery, a wide-open concrete room marked by a grid of pilotis. In this gallery space, I was particularly struck by how the current artist on display, Ingrid Olsen, used the mutable floor plan. The works were spread out around the room, guiding movement through the space just as a painter guides the eyes with lines and foci. Additionally, her work engaged the pilotis, which seems to be a recurring theme in installations at the Carpenter Center. We can see that the forms of the building and the program within are intertwined, in this case inspiring artists and curators to make creative choices. From the first floor, I took the stairs down to the basement, which houses student work and the Harvard Film Archive. Compared to the rest of the Carpenter Center, I got the impression of a neglected space. It felt like without the ability to play with light and the inside-outside relationship, the basement was a fairly conventional afterthought for Corbusier. Despite this, I assume that a basement is the perfect location for an archive of film, as the space is spared the exposure to the elements that the rest of the building insists on. The other entrance to the building, which is perhaps more apparent from its exterior, is located at the middle of the central ramp and enters directly into the third floor galleries, as well as studio space on the other side. From inside the studio, we can see into the cutout and get a sense for how the open floor plan could allow for different spatial arrangements. Just outside, this sculpture caught my eye. It might be a coincidence, but it almost seemed that the figure was standing across from its foil, a featureless column. Does the Carpenter Center speak to its art, or the other way around? Across the way, the third floor gallery, which opens to the aforementioned roof garden, employs the white cube space typical of contemporary galleries. The pieces featured here felt perfectly suited to their environment, as the soft directional light of the overcast day let them move between visible and camouflaged. While flipping through exhibition publications located in this gallery, I came across an interesting point by artist Renee Green, who spent 2 years in residency at the Carpenter Center. In her culminating exhibition, Within Living Memory, Green included a video whose voiceover commented on engaging with the legacy of the Carpenter Center's architect. Because it was designed by Le Corbusier, it is valued by some, who never lived there, like a shrine, a monument. It became part of the Corbu mythology and is kept alive by those who want to keep alive his precepts as they have interpreted them. But this place is also inhabited by those who weren't born in France, but who are from places where French is spoken, and by others who were born in France. They are the descendants of Africa, the Caribbean, the Middle East, South and East Asia, and a contested Europe. In this way, Green seeks not only to understand her distant connection to Le Corbusier, but to engage the mythology surrounding him with a discussion of colonial legacy. I found her insistence on a non-domestic structure being inhabited especially important. Although the Carpenter Center is not one of Corbusier's famous villas, it is essential to consider his design philosophy as not restricted to his design for homes. This necessarily requires us to consider his written magnum opus, Towards an Architecture, from 1920. One of his most famous quotes in this work reads, "A house is a machine for living in." Corbusier insists on functionality, that a building should first and foremost serve the interests of those who live there. Although he might not have considered the colonial legacy of France in the construction of the Carpenter Center, Green effectively creates an addendum to his philosophy, challenging those who would uphold his work as only meant to serve a certain class of people. A staff member whom I spoke to said that their favorite part of the Carpenter Center was the stairs. Although stairwells are typically considered solely functional and thus are without frills, I have to agree that it is here that Corbusier's genius shines. Look at the light. It ripples from the glass block window banks and emanates from strips along the overhanging steps. I only wish that I could have experienced this on a clear day, to see the warping patterns thrown onto every surface by direct sunlight. The windows align with the gridded handrails. Every detail feels meticulously combed into place. Following his death in 1965, the New York Times wrote, Le Corbusier has always represented himself as the pioneer of an essentially gracious architecture. Thus, in order of importance, he ranked the raw materials of the urbanist. The sky, trees, iron, cement. He wished to bring man the essential joys to which all have right: the sun, space, verdure. Maybe this is why the stairwell is my favorite place in the Carpenter Center. A common space, a utilitarian space, is reified, given the treatment of the best room in a villa. Movement, thus, is prioritized. I can imagine Corbusier traversing the stairs, creating his own sequence of events, telling his own story of the building. The Carpenter Center has received mixed reactions in the nearly 60 years since it was opened. In 2013, an article published in Boston-based publication The World described the building as having all the warmth of a highway on-ramp at first impression. The Harvard Crimson featured an article in 1963 which read that the harsh, raw severity of Le Corbusier jars a world conditioned to softer, more comfortable art forms. I can't bring myself to say that the building is necessarily beautiful. It employs a semi-brutal aesthetic and is hard to capture on video without also documenting its dark, dingy underbelly. In Le Corbusier, architect, painter, poet, Jean Genger writes that the absence of a clear brief deprived the architect of his usual functionalist approach, leading to a self-referential work which employed his motifs but did not necessarily fit the requirements of a visual arts center. While the Carpenter Center certainly has its flaws, it made me consider beauty in a way that I had not previously. I found that the building has a painterly quality if you look for it. Movement through it is needlessly confusing if you need to get somewhere, but in my wandering, the joy of simply moving through the space was enough. Sergei Eisenstein, a filmmaker and theorist, wrote, "It seems that all the arts throughout the centuries tended towards cinema. Conversely, cinema helps us to understand their methods." Corbusier's Carpenter Center is a building about time, about revealing itself chronologically. It is a building which is fundamentally about program, about exposing students and the public alike to new ideas. In this subtle way, it is a masterpiece.